In this video, I'm answering the question, how long can you stay in a calorie deficit? I'm even gonna show you an example of a client I just took through a fat loss phase, but here's what you need to know. First off, despite what you've heard, you can stay in a calorie deficit as long as your body can handle the added stress, meaning you're not getting overly hungry or your energy levels tank, and mentally you can handle it, which means you're still engaged in the process, you're still sticking to the things and adhering to the diet, and the diet itself isn't causing you to overeat or go backwards. But the right duration is gonna depend on your situation and the context. Let me break this down. First off, I wanna talk about short-term deficits, meaning between 4 weeks up to 12 weeks. Most people can handle a moderate calorie deficit, anywhere between 150 calories below your maintenance levels to upwards of 600 calorie deficit per day for several weeks to even months, especially if you're making the most of your food choices and eating enough protein. And this is often enough to see meaningful fat loss without some major side effects. Most people can sustain this, and you know this. It's not overly hard to be able to do that for shorter periods of time. Now, in shorter time frames, you can also pull off more aggressive calorie deficits, meaning over 500 calories per day under your maintenance levels. You're only going to want to do this for shorter periods of time because you're not going to be able, in most cases, to sustain it. What happens when you do too much for too long? You start putting yourself at risk for some metabolic adaptation, which means your metabolism is going to slow down because you're losing weight, but you're also taking in a lot less energy than you need. What happens? Your basal metabolic rate decreases, as well as the amount of energy that you would be burning through spontaneous movement, but also performance and exercise is also going to be decreased. You add that lower energy level to also being hungrier because you haven't been eating as much food or foods that you crave, and you're in a bad spot the more aggressive you get. So the further we go along into the deficit and the further you dip down, typically the shorter duration you want to make that diet. But that's probably not the reason why you're here. You really want to know, how long can I do a calorie deficit for? Can it be much longer than 3 months? Is my metabolism going to completely crash? Am I going to gain weight from not eating enough? Let's move on to the next duration, which is going to be a medium-term deficit between 3 months and 6 months. Longer deficits and longer time frames can work, but the longer you diet and the longer you stay in a calorie deficit, the more likely you are to experience some of the side effects that come along with dieting. And this typically means a more increased risk of losing lean body mass the further along you go, a larger impact on your metabolism, meaning that your metabolism is going to slow down more because, number one, you're moving around a smaller body, but also there's going to be impacts to your basal metabolic rate and the amount of energy you're burning. So your body's going to adapt to that as a way to conserve energy. But there's also going to be hormonal changes, making it harder to stick to and also increasing your appetite. And lastly, diet fatigue. Unless you have something firm to focus on, like a goal or a show, it's gonna be harder to stick to the same things. At this stage of the process, many people in a deficit would benefit from a diet break, which is typically an extended break from dieting, eating closer to maintenance levels for a period of time, 1 week to 4 weeks total, or refeed days, which are planned typically higher carbohydrate or higher calorie days to replenish some of your muscle glycogen, but also to replenish your energy stores to make you feel better overall and give you a mental break from dieting. You typically do these for 1 to 2 days, eating higher levels of carbs, and that will allow you to stick to your diet better moving forward because you had that little bit of break, both mentally, but also physically. Now, here's the important part. And if you take one thing away from this video, it would be this. Typically, the more weight you have to lose, the higher body fat you start at, the longer deficit you can be in, the longer duration of time. And this is good news because the more weight you have to lose, the longer it's gonna take to do. And even if you're losing weight at the higher end of the range that we would typically expect, usually, between 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week, or 1 to 2 pounds per week, even if you're losing 2 pounds per week, you can still do this for longer because you have a larger proportion of fat stores to pull from to make up that deficit. Meaning in most cases, less of it's going to come from muscle and have that impact on your metabolism because you have more body fat to lose. And just to drive this example home, I wanna show you and highlight a client, a fat loss client that I worked with over the last 8 months. Not all of that was dieting, but a lot of it was, at least 7 months of it was, that lost 30 plus pounds over the course of, what was his lowest, 205. So 30 pounds over those 7 months at a deficit of close to 600 to 800 calories per day before we did a reverse diet. So if I look at the original assessment, and this is a client that's worked with me intermittently over the last 6 or 7 years, but if you look at his body weight of 235 and his energy expenditure levels, typically he'd be at was at maintenance before we started, and that's at around like 3,200 calories. Needed to boost his protein right off the bat, but also bring his fat down and put him in a calorie deficit. But we started off at something closer to 2,800 calories to start, a moderate deficit, 400 calories roughly per day, added in a bit more cardio, weight dropped off right off the bat, but then through time, and this is gonna be 12 weeks, so the first 3 months, within the first 3 months, he was down to 224. So 11 pounds, maybe even 12 pounds over that first 12 weeks, right in line with what we would see, down to, with a refeed, some average calories of closer to like 2,600 a day. So close to a 600 calorie deficit. So moderate by all means, but he was able to sustain this for longer than 6 months. His metabolism didn't crash, his muscle didn't all fall off, he still continually made progress. But the reason why he was able to do that was because things were going really well for him. Like there wasn't huge issues with hunger. If anything, he was making the most of his food choices, so his appetite was well regulated. Things were in a really good spot that way. And I could sense that. I was asking about it, we were checking in about it. Had it been the opposite way, and he's like, I really can't stick to this, maybe we would have cut it off a little bit earlier. Maybe it would have been 4 months, maybe it would have been 16 weeks, something along those lines. But since he had that final goal and wanted to push ahead, we pushed ahead. By the end of the second 3-month block here, moving into June, he was down to 2,400 calories a day. There's a second refeed coming in here, which is that higher carbohydrate day, and down to 211. So down 24 pounds, like clockwork. Very consistent client, but we had stuck to do it to 6 months. So there's no golden rule around like, fat loss phase has to be 12 weeks or your metabolism crashes or anything like that. You gotta listen to your body, think about how things are going, feel out in terms of like hunger and energy levels and how long you can sustain this for, and go based on that. This is also where a coach is super, super helpful to make these objective decisions for you. And then from there, we also call the shots around a reverse diet. We started ramping food up once he got to that 30 pounds down mark, and reversed out of it. And at the end of our time working together, he found a new maintenance level at 2,800 calories. And if anything, was kind of at that place where maybe it was a slight deficit still, because he was maintaining, 205, and a lot slower weight was coming down. But this is a new level that he can maintain. We've found that and go from there. So it really depends on how you feel and the progress. So that's the biggest thing right off the bat. Now, can you really do this forever though? Let's talk about long-term deficits over 6 months plus. Now, staying in a calorie deficit indefinitely is not sustainable, and I'm not recommending that. Eventually, your body is going to adapt, hunger is going to rise, and your energy levels are going to decrease, making it harder to continually make progress. So continuing on the deficit doesn't make tons of sense. As well as if you've ever been around someone that's been in a long-term extended deficit, you know the implications of this stuff. There's implications to your hormones like thyroid and leptin, as well as sex hormones like testosterone, but also your hunger hormones like ghrelin. It is really tough to sustain. Your body is pushing back against you to get out of the deficit. as well as it's going to impact your mood and your recovery from exercise. You can't do this stuff forever. Now, with that being said, if you were my fat loss client and you were sitting in front of me, I wouldn't just blindly follow this rule of thumb around the timelines. I would coach you as the person right in front of me. So depending on how you're feeling with hunger and energy levels and how long you've been doing the deficit, and if you're continually making progress, that would all play into my recommendations for how long you would stay on the diet. Because if things are going well and you're not super hungry and you're still making progress, you can probably go longer than you would think, which is going to be good news for people that have a lot of weight to lose. Now, with that being said, it's still not a bad idea to break this up, break it into chunks or longer phases. Coaches often recommend alternating between phases of a calorie deficit, and the deficit will depend on how far you want to take things or your timeline, and alternate that between periods of maintenance or a slight surplus. This allows your body weight to stabilize and then push ahead once you're back at it and ready to go. And although there are physiological impacts of dieting, your ability to sustain the diet in most cases is going to come down to the mental load. How are you feeling about it? Are you still enjoying things? Are you still able to stick with it? For me, that would dictate how long you should be on the diet. So what you're seeing here is how long someone should be on a calorie deficit should depend on their progress, as well as how much weight they have to lose and the aggressiveness of the calorie deficit. Think about it this way. Let's talk about an analogy. Let's say you just got let go of your job. Sorry, you're out of work. And you have a certain amount of money saved up to pay for your basic living expenses until you run out. If you spend a lot of that money, you'll run out sooner. But if it's a moderate or minimal amount, you're really scraping your pennies and making your budget go further, you can live off that total amount of money for longer. A calorie deficit is the same. Depending on how much money you have to start with, how quickly you're spending it, and how likely you are to stick to that budget, that should dictate how long the diet is. So no, you can't stay in a calorie deficit forever, nor should you, but some of these variables are going to determine how long you can do it. And that's it, folks. A calorie deficit should last until you reach your goal, or until your body tells you it's time for an extended diet break, or some more time at maintenance, and breaking this up into different phases. And some of those signs will be extreme fatigue, poor recovery, poor progress, and if you're having a tough time sticking to the diet. And if that's the case, it's time to back off and spend a bit more time at maintenance or in a slight calorie surplus before going back to the diet. And if you've been at this a while, it's usually a good rule of thumb to spend 4 to 5 times more time in a calorie surplus or around maintenance than you do in a calorie deficit, to make sure you're not just constantly becoming a smaller version of yourself and putting on some muscle. With that being said, many coaches use a 2 to 4 month calorie deficit dieting phase and then alternate between that and periods of 2 to 6 weeks of maintenance, then repeat as needed. But it really comes down to your progress and how you're handling things. And that's it, folks. That's the answer to the question, how long should you stay in a calorie deficit? If you enjoyed this video, you're gonna love the video I've linked up right here. In this video, I'm talking about what happens after the calorie deficit. We're gonna talk about the concept of reverse dieting, what it is, and if you need it. You're gonna learn all about that in this video I've linked up right here. So check it out now, and I'll see you in the next video.